So please, a Great Green Festival welcome for Dr. Helen Caldicott.
Thank you. Well, I come to you today as a physician representing my colleagues, the medical profession. We're worried about tobacco smoking, and we have eliminated or barred it from indoor areas and some outdoor areas because smoking gives people emphysema and lung cancer and various other sorts of cancer. It's a big health hazard. We're worried about asbestos because that gives people cancer too. But the really serious industry that is a carcinogenic industry beyond anything else is the nuclear industry. It's a carcinogenic industry which will over generations induce random compulsory genetic engineering and epidemics of malignancy, particularly in children, for the rest of time. It's a killing industry. And it's very interesting because it was moribund because of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island until recently. Unfortunately, I've got a map here of Europe which we can't project because we don't have a projector, a transparency projector, but it shows Europe still covered with radioactive fallout, and Europe will be radioactive. 40% of Europe is still radioactive, 40%. I see people eating dried apricots. Many dried apricots come from Turkey. Turkey had a huge radioactive fallout. I went to my health food shop the other day and it's full of Turkish dried apricots. And I said, "Are these radioactive?" And the man said, "They're organic." And I said, "Yes, but are they radioactive?" And they haven't been tested. I do not on principle buy European food because you don't know what food carries strontium-90 or cesium-137 or radioactive iodine-129 or plutonium. Therefore, it's medically contraindicated at this stage to eat European food. What about the Europeans? Well, they have to eat, don't they? And after Chernobyl, they got such a fright, you know, they didn't know what to eat for 3 years, but gradually the psychic numbing descends and they forget about it. But we're now starting to see the incidence of cancer rising. I think it's important for you to note that the incubation time for cancer once you've inhaled or ingested radioactive materials is 5 to 60 years. Whereas if I have a cold and I sneeze on you, within 2 days you're sneezing. The incubation time for a cold or flu is 2 days. For measles, mumps, chickenpox, rubella, it's 3 weeks. But for cancer, it's a long time. And if you, in fact, eat a mussel or a lobster that's caught in Chesapeake Bay, into which drains water from 6 nuclear power plants, and those isotopes concentrate in the fish in Chesapeake Bay, that beautiful bay, if you get a breast cancer or a bone cancer or leukemia 20 years after you eat the lobster or the mussel, it doesn't wear a little flag saying, "I was made by some strontium-90 you ate in a mussel or a lobster 20 years ago." In other words, cancers do not denote their origin. So how do we know radiation causes cancer? Well, it started right at the beginning. Madame Curie refined radium from pitchblende, and she used to walk around with it in her pocket, just a little bit of it, playing with it in her lab coat. Now, because radium is a calcium analog and it goes to bone and it's very radioactive, she died of leukemia. Her daughter also died of leukemia. So right from the start of the nuclear age, we knew that these materials caused cancer. During the Manhattan Project, these scientists who worked with plutonium and the like were aware that plutonium is incredibly toxic. In fact, when they tested plutonium and injected it into beagle dogs, they couldn't find a low enough dose, 10 to the minus 9 grams, that didn't give all the beagle dogs cancer. Why did we develop nuclear power then in the 50s? The reason is that the men who made the bombs were so guilt-ridden about blowing up and vaporizing and killing 200,000 people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they felt they could harness atoms for peace. So they called it sunshine units, too cheap to meter, and so that they would be able to use their discovery to better the human race. But in fact, I worked with those men intensively and closely during the years when we held the symposia on the medical effects of nuclear war. And they were guilt-ridden, and they knew that nuclear power was dangerous. In fact, Albert Einstein said, nuclear power is a hell of a way to boil water. Now, what is nuclear power? Well, it is a crazy way to boil water. And let me start at the beginning of the fuel chain. In Australia, where I come from, we have 40% of the world's richest uranium. We're sitting on uranium. Why? Well, Australia's the oldest continent on Earth, and it's all been worn away. So there are nuggets of gold in the creek beds, there are mountains of iron, and there's uranium everywhere. And so what we want to do is we want to dig it up and sell it as fast as we can and make money. And so we're exporting, in effect, cancer. But our Prime Minister either doesn't care or doesn't know or is scientifically and medically illiterate. His name is John Howard. He's the most dangerous Prime Minister Australia has ever had. And he's very close, like that with George Bush, who I think is the most dangerous president America's ever had. I think John Howard is smarter than George Bush in IQ points, but they still go along the same lines in promoting a nuclear future and a nuclear world, which means no future for our children. And I'm going to get back to global warming in a minute, because nuclear power is said is the answer to global warming. So let's start at the beginning. When you dig up uranium, how do you dig it up? They have these great big diggers and huge trucks, all fueled by fossil fuel. So when you burn the fossil fuel, out goes carbon dioxide. So the beginning of the nuclear fuel cycle, millions of tons of uranium ore are dug up, creates massive quantities of CO2, which is the main global warming gas. Now, uranium mining is dangerous. 20 to 50% of men who've mined uranium have died of lung cancer. Many of them are Navajo Indians, Indigenous people in Canada, and people in Australia are Aborigines. They live near the uranium deposits and the tailings dams. How does it cause cancer? Because uranium consistently emits radon, which is a radioactive gas. You know, if you live in a basement in Maine and there's a lot of granite there and the granite emits a lot of radon gas, it's dangerous, and you've probably read about that. Radon gas gets into the lung, irradiating a tiny volume of cells, and later on those men get cancer. Now, also in the ore is radium. It's a daughter of uranium. Radium is what gave Madame Curie leukemia. Radium is a calcium analogue. I was meant to have a whiteboard here so I could draw you femurs and lungs and things, but it's not here to give you a medical lecture. So I have to paint verbal pictures. But if you ingest and swallow radium in the dust, it goes to your bone and irradiates a tiny volume of cells. So later on, years later, you can get a bone cancer, have your leg amputated, probably die from secondary cancers, or you might get leukemia, which is cancer of the white blood cells, which are made in the bone marrow. So those men who mine uranium are at risk for lung cancer, bone cancer and leukemia, and also the radioactive ore face continually emits gamma radiation like X-rays, low doses, but the whole body receives a radiation dose, including the testicles. In a man, the most important organs in the male body are the testicles from an evolutionary perspective, because they contain the genes that will make all future generations. So if their testicles are irradiated, so they could have damaged children or pass genetic abnormalities on to future generations. It's important to note there are 16,000 genetic diseases now described. Cystic fibrosis, diabetes, phenylketonuria, mental retardation, thousands of them. My specialty is cystic fibrosis. I was on the faculty at Harvard in the cystic fibrosis clinic. 1 in 25 Caucasians carry the gene for cystic fibrosis, but you don't know you carry it until you mate with someone with the same gene because it's a recessive gene. Like blue eyes. You can only have blue eyes if you have two blue-eyed genes. Genes go in pairs. You can have brown eyes if you have one brown-eyed gene and a blue-eyed gene, or two brown eyes. So here's a quiz. Two parents both had blue eyes, and they had a brown-eyed baby. Question, where did the brown-eyed gene come from? Who? The milkman. Yeah, the milkman. So actually, it's better than a DNA test. So you don't know you carry these abnormal genes until later on you mate with someone or your descendants mate with someone with the same gene. It might take 20 generations for a genetic abnormality to express itself. Now, how does radiation cause cancer? You know that your body is made of trillions of cells, and in every cell there's a gene that controls the rate of cell division. If that gene is damaged by radiation, be it X-rays, and let me tell you, never have an unnecessary X-ray. All radiation is cumulative. Each dose you receive adds to your risk of getting cancer. Do not let your dentist X-ray your teeth every year. It's absolutely unnecessary, and he or she is making money. I know because my ex-husband was a radiologist. If you've got a sore tooth, you need an X-ray, but that's all. Don't let doctors practice defensive medicine. If you have pneumonia, have an X-ray. The risk is minimal, the benefit is great. If you have a broken arm and it needs setting and rearranging, have an X-ray. But don't have unnecessary X-rays. It's cumulative. So what radiation does is damage the regulatory gene in a biochemical way, the DNA molecule. And then the cell will sit latent quietly, any time from 5 to 60 years. That's called the latent period of carcinogenesis. And one day, instead of the cell dividing by mitosis into two daughter cells, it goes berserk and produces millions and trillions of cells, and that's a cancer. In other words, it takes a single mutation in a single gene in a single cell to kill you. And on the whole, we can't stop that uncontrolled growth of cells. We might even remove the primary cancer from the prostate or the lung or whatever, breast. But cancer cells are very invasive and they get into the vessels and the lymph vessels and they go to a lymph gland or to the brain or the lung and grow into a second cancer or a metastasis. And so cancers spread and it's very hard to stop their growth. We can cure a lot of childhood cancers now, but adult cancers are hard to control. Now, the second thing is, in the eggs and sperm are the genes for all future generations. We are who we are because we've got human genes, although 99.2% of our genes are the same as a chimpanzee, so we actually don't know a lot about genetics. But, you know, I've got a long nose like my father and reddish hair like my father and eyes like my mother, and so you inherit your genetic characteristics from your mother and father. So if the genes are damaged, they can cause genetic abnormalities or deformities in the children. Okay? So that's just a very brief and very simplistic lesson in genetics. Now, why do we use radiation to treat cancer? That's the next question people ask. Well, rapidly dividing cells are very sensitive to being killed by radiation. That's why babies and children are 10 to 20 times more sensitive to the carcinogenic effects of radiation than adults. Okay? So are cancers. So what you do is you isolate the cancer and you zap it with huge doses of radiation, hoping to kill the cancer, and we often do. But what happens is sometimes normal body cells surrounding a cancer get mutated, and people who survive their primary cancer, sometimes 10, 20 years later, go on to get a second primary cancer from the radiation therapy, but it's worth it. They've had another 20 years of life. Well, what about nuclear medicine? Why do we use radioactive elements to diagnose thyroid cancer or to treat it? Because they're very effective. For diagnosis, you get a lower dose than probably from a classical intravenous parallelogram X-ray. the isotopes decay very quickly, they're short-lived. You don't need a nuclear reactor to make the isotopes used in medicine. They can all be made from a cyclotron. So that's a basic course in carcinogenesis and genetics. And it's all in my book here called Nuclear Power is Not the Answer. Unfortunately, there are only 20 books out there, but you can get it on Amazon, and I'll sign them for you if you buy it. But basic radiation biology is in here, very easy to understand, and you need to know it. President Bush needs to know it, although I'm not sure if he has the neurons enough to actually get it, or maybe he would if he attended. Cheney does have the IQ, but I don't think he cares about future generations, even though he's had a new grandbaby. Maybe he does, I don't know, but he's not acting in the way that he would indicate that he cares about future generations. Now, once uranium is mined, and let me tell you, if all electricity today was generated from nuclear power, there's only 9 years' supply in the world of uranium. So it's a very finite resource that leaves radioactive waste that lasts for 500,000 years, okay? Then you crush the uranium ore with big crushers, more fossil fuel, and then it's taken to Paducah, Kentucky, our uranium, and it's converted to a gas called uranium hexafluoride. And that gas is forced through tiny little micropores in a big nickel plate. And it requires so much electricity to do that, the uranium enrichment plant has 2 huge coal-fired plants to supply the electricity. Well, guess what? When you burn coal, what does it make? CO2. Also, 93% of the CFC gas in America that is released comes from that enrichment plant from leaking pipes. What does CFC gas do? It destroys the ozone layer. We've got hardly any ozone in Australia. I've had a malignant melanoma. 1 in 9 of us get melanomas. We have skin cancers all over our faces because there's hardly any ozone. So it was banned under the Montreal Protocol, but the nuclear industry has been, quotes, grandfathered out of the Montreal Protocol. However, CFC gas is 10,000 to 20,000 times more potent as a global warmer than carbon dioxide. Another way nuclear power adds to global warming. Then you have to build a huge sarcophagus. This huge nuclear reactor to make concrete requires a huge amount, it releases a lot of carbon dioxide. Then you have to decommission the nuclear power plant after it's operated for about 24 years because it's so radioactive. Men can't go in there anymore and operate it because they get huge doses of radiation. So you let it cool for decades and then you cut it apart by remote control using robots. More CO2. The radioactive waste has to be cooled for decades, circulating water through it. More CO2. Then it has to be packed into trucks and transported to God knows where. Nobody knows what to do with it. And stored, isolated from the environment for 500,000 years. Now, I've debated with the nuclear industry for 35 years, and they say, trust us, we're good scientists, we'll find the cure to radioactive waste storage. And I say, well, that's like saying to a patient, look, you've got a pancreatic carcinoma, you'll probably die in 6 months, but trust me, I'm a fantastic scientist, and in 20 years' time I'll find the cure. Anyway, they probably will never find the cure, and those men who are creating nuclear power and nuclear waste will all be dead soon. And in science, you develop a hypothesis which you either prove or disprove in your lifetime. Not say, well, we'll be able to find the cure in 500,000 years. And let me tell you, the nuclear industry lies with impunity. I remember when I was younger being in Chicago one night on NPR, debating with a nuclear scientist from GPU. And he said, we know what to do with radioactive waste. And I said, no, you don't. He said, yes, I do. And the angrier he got, the deeper his voice became and the more credible he sounded. The more upset I became, the higher my voice went, and I was less credible. Then he took me out to the pub for a beer afterwards, and he said, actually, we don't know what to do with radioactive waste. He said, as far as I'm concerned, you can bury it in your own backyard, he said to me, quote, unquote. I said, you were lying, and he said, yes. That's my absolutely total experience with the nuclear industry. When I debated with generals about nuclear war, that was easier because they knew that if a bomb dropped on Washington, that out to 5 miles everyone would be vaporized, and out to 20 miles everyone would be lethally burnt. And they knew that, and they knew that if we had a nuclear war, they couldn't play their war games and it wouldn't be much fun. So they were much easier to debate with than these nuclear power people. So at the moment, a nuclear power plant produces 30% of the amount of CO2 as a similar-sized gas-fired plant, but as the concentration of uranium in the available ore declines, within 10 or 20 years, nuclear power will produce the same amount of global warming gas as a fossil fuel plant. So you may as well burn the fossil fuel. So it makes me really angry. The first chapter is about that. When the nuclear industry lies. Now, scientists are not supposed to lie. If I lied in medicine, I'd be killing my patients, and I would be deregistered. It is medically contraindicated to lie, particularly about an industry that's going to produce so much disease and death and tragedy. And when I talk about treating a child dying of cystic fibrosis or leukemia, and how heartrending it is, and how the parents never recover, the nuclear industry accused me of being emotional. And therefore, you cannot be credible if you actually allow your right brain to enter the equation and show some emotion. However, if those men themselves develop cancer or their children are dying of cystic fibrosis, they're the first ones to fall into my arms and weep. If I tell parents that their child has leukemia and they show no emotion, I get them a psychiatrist. It's imperative that we be emotional about, I go back to the Holocaust. Recent photographs have emerged, and we've seen them in the Australian press, from Dachau or Birkenwald, one of the death camps. And there are the Nazis lying back, eating blueberries, drinking, and the women are dancing and kicking up their heels and stuff. They're the staff that were at the death camps, and these photographs have just only appeared. And that's true psychopathy. And that's, in effect, what we're doing in a way, well, and I can get into Iraq in a minute, but by allowing the nuclear industry to proceed with what they're doing. When the uranium is made, it's enriched into uranium-235, it's made into little pellets like chalk and packed into long fuel rods, 1/2 an inch thick and 12 feet long, and taken to a reactor where 100 tons of uranium is packed into the core and is submerged in water. And as you pull out the moderating rods, the mass of uranium reaches critical mass and releases E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass by the speed of light squared, the Einstein formula. And tremendous heat is produced, and the heat boils the water, and the steam is taken off, which turns the turbine, which generates electricity. And this may well be nuclear electricity that has these lights on, and we probably don't need these lights on, because it's actually light outside, and we've got a nuclear reactor in the sky that provides us with the heat and the light that we require. It's important to know where your electricity is generated. Very important. So what happens when you generate electricity from nuclear power? You make 200 new elements that never existed before we fissioned uranium. Radioactive iodine that causes thyroid cancer. When 3 Mile Island melted down, and I've got data from a whistleblower from 3 Mile Island, a lot of iodine got out. In fact, Hershey's chocolates is 13 miles from 3 Mile Island, and that's where all the cows graze. It's the richest dairying area in America. They were so worried about the radioactive iodine, which was very high in the milk, they powdered the milk for 6 weeks, because iodine only lasts for 6 weeks and then it decays away to nothing. They powdered the milk at Hershey's. But other elements got out too, like strontium-90 and cesium and plutonium. We don't know how much got out, because when the accident occurred, the monitors measuring the radiation level went right off scale in the first few minutes. And so they did calculations about how much got out, but no one knows. The radiation reached right up to Boston. So the people around there were developing acute radiation illness. Their hair was falling out. They developed bleeding and red skin, and yet the industry will say no one died and no one was hurt. There's been no decent epidemiological follow-up of those people living around 3 Mile Island. If you don't want to find out what you're doing, don't do the study. And that's exactly what's happened. At Chernobyl, well, here's Europe, most of it's still radioactive. Over 8,000 people have had their thyroids removed for thyroid cancer. There are huge epidemics of leukemia. There are homes full of terribly deformed children, all bent up and mentally retarded from this. Yet the industry will say only 56 people died at Chernobyl, which is a lie. And now they're saying, well, they're the answer to global warming, which is also a lie because they create global warming in their own right. We know the nuclear industry can't exist without you paying for it. It is a totally socialised industry in a country that believes in capitalism. So what you see is socialism for the nuclear industry and many corporations, but it's capitalism for all of us because we have to provide our own health care, our own health insurance and the like. In Australia, we've got free medical care. Well, we pay for it. It comes from our tax dollars. Your tax dollars go to subsidise industries that are causing global warming and epidemics of cancer, and the military. It is ironic to me that we walked in and on the ground floor there's a huge conference, a huge military conference with men with the most ghastly guns. It's a killing conference because war is about murder. And the next book I write is going to be called Why Men Kill, and maybe Why Women Let Them. But it's interesting to me that here's a wonderful group of people who want to save the planet from global warming, nuclear power and maybe nuclear war, and underneath, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, obviously, is the army having its own conference about how better to kill people. I think you need to think about that, maybe do something about it while you're here. Don't let them get away with it. Do something. Medea could probably organise it. I don't know if she's around or not, but Medea Benjamin is good at organising things like that. Now, the other elements made, one is strontium-90 that lasts for 600 years and it gets into bone, causing bone cancer and leukemia. And you see, when these elements land on the grass, they get concentrated hundreds of times by the grass. And then the cattle eat the grass and they're concentrated hundreds of times in the milk. And the lactating woman drinks the milk with strontium-90 in it and it goes through her breast, maybe on the way, inducing a mutation later to give her breast cancer. And the baby drinks the radioactive milk and the strontium goes into the baby's bone, later to give the baby maybe leukemia or cancer, okay? That's called bioconcentration in the food chain. Same in the Chesapeake Bay. Reactors use 1 million gallons a minute of water to keep them cool out of the Susquehanna River and those rivers, and it's all draining into the Chesapeake Bay. Mildly radioactive, but the algae concentrated by orders of magnitude, then the crustaceans, then the little fish, then the big fish, and then we eat the fish. And we stand at the pyramid, the top, the apex of the food chain. And you can't taste radiation, because our senses didn't evolve to say, I can taste the strontium-90 in this piece of fish. You can't see it. You can't hear it. It's silent, latent, cryptogenic, but the incidence of cancer is rising. Do we not know that? And the medical dictum says, if you can't cure cancer, you must prevent it. Okay, so the next one is cesium-137, which lasts for 600 years, and that causes brain cancers, muscle cancers. Much of the European contamination is from cesium that came from Chernobyl. In Wales, in Britain, there are over 300 farms growing lambs that are so full of cesium they can't sell them on the market. The same in Cumbria, the same in Sweden. all over. This is what a meltdown at a nuclear power plant involves. And last but not least is plutonium, named after Pluto, not the dog, but the god of hell. Plutonium is so toxic, I told you, that maybe 10 to the minus 9 grams is carcinogenic. The body thinks it's iron, so it's stored in the bone where hemoglobin is made, causing bone cancer and leukemia, causes lung cancer, liver cancer, and it gets past the placenta, which lets nothing past, and into the developing embryo where it can kill a cell that's going to form the left half of the brain or the right arm, like thalidomide did. You know that drug where babies were born with no arms or no legs? Only plutonium is thalidomide forever because its half-life is 24,400 years and it lasts for 500,000 years. Many men in the Northern Hemisphere have a tiny amount of plutonium in their testicles because it's still falling out from the stratosphere from the weapons testing days of Russia, America and China. And it lodges next to the cells of the precursors of the sperm. So you can see the plutonium can induce mutations that are passed on generation to generation. While if the man is what's it called when you burn bodies? Incinerated? No. What? Cremated. The smoke goes out the chimney with his plutonium so someone else can breathe it. So you can see that plutonium can cause an exponential increase in genetic disease forevermore. Plutonium is fantastic because it's what you make bombs out of. You need about 2 or 3 kilos to make yourself a bomb. The design is on the internet. All you need to do is steal a lump of plutonium and buy the stuff from the local hardware shop. I don't know why we haven't had a terrorist nuclear weapon yet. Each reactor makes 200 kilos of plutonium a year, so any country that has a nuclear reactor has the ability to make about 100 bombs a year. That's why people are worried, and so America says, well, look, it's all right, we've got about 11,000 nuclear weapons, 5,500 are on hair trigger alert, ready to go with the press of the button by your wonderful commander-in-chief. He gets 3 minutes to decide whether or not to press the button, and it's a bit of a worry if he's woken up from REM force sleep at 3 a.m. in the morning to say, Mr. Bush, the weapons are on their way, what are you going to do? Here's your computer. Which button are you going to press? In fact, Yeltsin got to within 10 seconds of blowing up the planet in 1995 when the Russian early warning system made a mistake and thought a Norwegian missile was in fact a first strike from America, because the Pentagon still has a policy to fight and win a nuclear war against Russia. And the Russians never know when you're going to strike by accident. On 9/11, you got to the 2nd or 3rd highest state of nuclear alert because no one knew what was happening. That could happen any day. What if Cheney prevails, which he always does, and he starts dropping nuclear weapons on Iran? What will Russia do that's got 2,500 hydrogen bombs aimed at you? And the weapons take half an hour to go from woe to go, and in that time your weapons are launched and the whole thing's over in an hour. There are at least 60 hydrogen bombs targeted on Washington alone, 40 on New York. I wrote an article about this with Robert McNamara. In fact, we've got enough weapons to overkill every person on Earth 12 times. That's a Pentagon term, because medically you can only die once. And the policy still is for America to go first and wipe Russia off the face of the Earth, but you'll all die too. And no one is attending to this incredible medical danger that will create the final epidemic of the human race and turn the Earth into a lump of rock like Mars. Why isn't anyone talking about it? What is this psychic numbing that we carry around, that we have such manic denial? We're all into gourmet foods, or what are we into? But we're not attending to make sure that our children have a future. So, to sum up, nuclear power's made 54,000 tonnes of radioactive waste, and there's nowhere to put it. They found this mountain in Nevada called Yucca Mountain that's transected by 32 earthquake faults made of pumice, a very permeable stone. They've spent $9 billion. It's not going to work. Harry Reid has said over his dead body, does 54,000 tonnes of radioactive waste get stored in Nevada, so there's nowhere to put it. And the cooling pools next to your reactors are getting fuller and fuller of radioactive waste, and they keep making more. Why are they doing it when it's not a profit-making organisation, when it creates global warming, and it will over time? People will wake up in the morning, their breast milk will all be ready to be radioactive, they'll be giving birth to deformed babies, and their children will be getting cancer at the age of 5 instead of 60. It's so we can turn our lights on. It's so we can turn our computers on. It's so we can turn our VCRs on. Don't forget, Mozart wrote by candlelight. So did Shakespeare. We've lived and survived for 3 million years without electricity. But the most important point to note is that we, Arjun Makajani at IEER and I, have created a roadmap for America for a carbon-free, nuclear-free future by 2050. No carbon and no nuclear. It's a 267-page study, most intricate, beautifully done, economically, technologically. Americans can save 28% of the electricity they currently use by turning off their lights. But it's solar, wind, geothermal, tidal, you name it. And nuclear, if you remove the subsidies, which are your tax dollars from nuclear, it dies. No carbon trading, because the mafia will get into that. Tony Soprano will be into it like a flash. No carbon trading, a hard cap of $30 to $40 per tonne of CO2, and people will stop producing CO2 and get into alternatives. Silicon Valley calls green energy green, not because it's green, because it makes a lot of greenbacks. The fourth richest man in China is a big man developing solar power and selling it all over the world. You've got enough sun in your country to supply 3 times more electricity than you currently use. Every building should be backfitted to be a solar collector. Hot water, solar electricity. No building should be built without it facing south, without it being a solar collector, solar electricity, the whole thing. Architects have a huge responsibility, but we've got a plan, the prescription for survival for a nuclear-free, carbon-free future. That's very exciting. The nuclear industry has to be closed down like now. Now! And last but not least, we must have bilateral nuclear disarmament because of the 30,000 nuclear weapons in the world. Russia and America own 97% of them. And yet Bush is running around the world with a microscope looking at Iran. They don't have nuclear weapons. It's America that has most of them, and everyone emulates you. And if you do the right thing and you work with Russia to abolish nuclear weapons, and guess who's promoting that? Barack Obama called for the elimination of nuclear weapons the other day, and I'm going to ring up his campaign and I'm going to work for him. That's the most important thing anybody could ever say in this campaign, and Hillary Clinton hasn't got the guts. If we have a nuclear war tonight, which could happen, doesn't matter, we'll all be radioactive atoms in the stratosphere. Okay? So the 3 major health issues facing the planet now are nuclear power, global warming, and it's beyond time to fix global warming now. That CO2 stays up there for 100 years. We've got to stop driving SUVs. We've got to get on our bicycles. We've got to turn off every light in the house. But more than that, we've got to organise that Congress, who are totally out to lunch at the moment, being lobbied by God knows who for oil, for coal, for gas, for nuclear. They've got to stop it. And the people who stop it are you. Your politicians are your representatives. You are their leaders. And when we organised the Freeze campaign in the 80s, remember 80% of Americans supported the end of nuclear war and nuclear weapons, I would go into Tip O'Neill's office and he would come off the House floor, he was chairing the House, and say, "What can I do for you, Doctor?" Because 80% of Americans wanted an end to the nuclear arms race. And we bloody well did it. We did it, you and I. I met with Reagan for an hour and a quarter in the Oval Office, in the White House, holding his hand because he got very uptight, and I had to establish a doctor-patient relationship with him and settle him down. And I talked to him about nuclear weapons, about which he knew nothing. Didn't know numbers, figures, data, technology. And I thought I'd had no influence. But then he started to say nuclear war must never be fought and can never be won. And he started working with Gorbachev. And together they met in Reykjavik in '87, and they almost agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons. It can be done. And every single one of you can be as powerful as the most powerful person who ever lived. More powerful than Henry Kissinger or Dick Cheney. I came to this country as a young female doctor saying I'm going to close down nuclear power, which I didn't, but get rid of nuclear weapons. And I was an alien. People said, "Who are you? You're an alien, you're naive." But it was the naivety that led me forward, and the passion. We are now physicians, all of us, you and I, to a planet that's in the intensive care unit, critically ill. But we can save it. We've got the answers. All we have to do is get off our bottoms and our couches and get out there and fix it. Well, I wish you luck. I can tell you more things. I've got a picture of a Trident submarine here. Maybe I'll end with that so you just get a vision of what I'm talking about. You've got 18 Trident submarines, 14 of which have nuclear weapons. On each Trident are 24 missiles, and on each missile are 8 hydrogen bombs 100 times larger than the Hiroshima bomb, each accurately targeted to their specific cities. And don't forget, 1,000 bombs can produce nuclear winter and the end of life on Earth, and there are 30,000. So I need 5 volunteers, you, and you. Come on, up on the stage. And I'm going to show you a Trident, so you get a visual impact of the enormous madness, nuclear madness that I've been talking about and what you have to do. Okay, stand in front. One end. Each one of those sheets is a missile. So there are 24 of those sheets, each representing a missile, and each of the black cylinders is a hydrogen bomb 100 times larger than the Hiroshima bomb that killed 120,000 people. And you've got 14 of these monsters sailing the seas at any time silently under the oceans. Okay? That's why that conference downstairs is so dangerous. We have to stop killing each other. We have to stop killing each other. Thank you.
So please, a Great Green Festival welcome for Dr. Helen Caldicott.
Thank you. Well, I come to you today as a physician representing my colleagues, the medical profession. We're worried about tobacco smoking, and we have eliminated or barred it from indoor areas and some outdoor areas because smoking gives people emphysema and lung cancer and various other sorts of cancer. It's a big health hazard. We're worried about asbestos because that gives people cancer too. But the really serious industry that is a carcinogenic industry beyond anything else is the nuclear industry. It's a carcinogenic industry which will, over generations, induce random compulsory genetic engineering and epidemics of malignancy, particularly in children, for the rest of time. It's a killing industry. And it's very interesting because it was moribund because of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island until recently. Unfortunately, I've got a map here of Europe, which we can't project because we don't have a projector, a transparency projector, but it shows Europe still covered with radioactive fallout, and Europe will be radioactive. 40% of Europe is still radioactive, 40%. I see people eating dried apricots. Many dried apricots come from Turkey. Turkey had a huge radioactive fallout. I went to my health food shop the other day and it's full of Turkish dried apricots. And I said, "Are these radioactive?" And the man said, "They're organic." And I said, "Yes, but are they radioactive?" And they haven't been tested. I do not on principle buy European food because you don't know what food carries strontium-90 or cesium-137 or radioactive iodine-129 or plutonium. Therefore, it's medically contraindicated at this stage to eat European food. What about the Europeans? Well, they have to eat, don't they? And after Chernobyl, they got such a fright, you know, they didn't know what to write at the beginning. Madame Curie refined radium from pitchblende, and she used to walk around with it in her pocket, just a little bit of it, playing with it in her lab coat. Now, because radium is a calcium analog and it goes to bone and it's very radioactive, she died of leukemia. Her daughter also died of leukemia. So right from the start of the nuclear age, we knew that these materials caused cancer. During the Manhattan Project, these scientists who worked with plutonium and the like were aware that plutonium is incredibly toxic. In fact, when they tested plutonium and injected it into beagle dogs, they couldn't find a low enough dose, 10 to the minus 9 grams, that didn't give all the beagle dogs cancer. Why did we develop nuclear power then in the 50s? The reason is that the men who made the bombs were so guilt-ridden about blowing up and vaporizing and killing 200,000 people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they felt they could harness atoms for peace. So they called it sunshine units, too cheap to meter, to eat for 3 years, but gradually the psychic numbing descends and they forget about it. But we're now starting to see the incidence of cancer rising. I think it's important for you to note that the incubation time for cancer once you've inhaled or ingested radioactive materials is 5 to 60 years. Whereas if I have a cold and I sneeze on you, within 2 days you're sneezing. The incubation time for a cold or flu is 2 days. For measles, mumps, chickenpox, rubella, it's 3 weeks. But for cancer, it's a long time. And if you, in fact, eat a mussel or a lobster that's caught in Chesapeake Bay, into which drains water from 6 nuclear power plants, and those isotopes concentrate in the fish in Chesapeake Bay, that beautiful bay, if you get a breast cancer or a bone cancer or leukemia 20 years after you eat the lobster or the mussel, it doesn't wear a little flag saying, "I was made by some strontium-90 you ate in a mussel or a lobster 20 years ago." In other words, cancers do not denote their origin. So how do we know radiation causes cancer? Well, it started, and so that they would be able to use their discovery to better the human race. But in fact, I worked with those men intensively and closely during the years when we held the symposia on the medical effects of nuclear war. And they were guilt-ridden and they knew that nuclear power was dangerous. In fact, Albert Einstein said, "Nuclear power is a hell of a way to boil water." Now, what is nuclear power? Well, it is a crazy way to boil water. And let me start at the beginning of the fuel chain. In Australia, where I come from, we have 40% of the world's richest uranium. We're sitting on uranium. Why? Well, Australia's the oldest continent on Earth, and it's all been worn away. So there are nuggets of gold in the creek beds, there are mountains of iron, and there's uranium everywhere. And so what we want to do is we want to dig it up and sell it as fast as we can and make money. And so we're exporting, in effect, cancer. But our Prime Minister either doesn't care or doesn't know or is scientifically and medically illiterate. His name is John Howard. He's the most dangerous Prime Minister